All right, folks. I am so excited to have Mike Thelander here today. He is the president and founder of Signals Research Group, and he has been in this industry for a very long time. And if you know anything about networks, you have probably read one of his reports at some point. So, Mike, welcome, and really looking forward to what you've got to say today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I apologize for having some technical difficulties with my video, but I am here and I am fully clothed, just to point that out. The presentation does say 2 decades. I'm not going to go back and talk about CDMA 2000 results when I tested back in the day. I am going to be fast forwarding a little bit, make it more relevant, talk about some of the 5G testing we've done out in the field, some of the interesting results that we have seen in our testing. So in case you don't know who Signals Research Group is, it's a company I started back in 2004, kind of fast forward to today, and basically everything we do is benchmark related. That's rather for our publication called Signals Ahead, or it's doing sponsored studies on behalf of clients. We primarily focus on the radio access network. That's the device, that's the phone, that's the chipset, that's the radio, that's the network as well. We also do some testing of applications on top of that. So VoLTE, VONAR as an example, various video chat applications. We've done 58 studies on 5G since 5G first launched. Our most recent study was looking at AT&T's Open RAN network with Onefinity and Ericsson RUs with a common DU. And then next week, we're coming out with a report looking at Release 17 uplink transmit switching. So that kind of gives you an idea of how technically focused we are in terms of testing 4G, 5G, and one day 6G. So this is a study we did back in May 2022 during COVID. You see Tariq there pose for us, making some sushi on our behalf. This was testing that we did in Tokyo. For this particular study, I used AccuVair's XCal Solo unit. This is a handheld unit. It really allows you to capture all of the chipset diagnostic information that's coming out of the chipset. Really provides a very robust look at the network and how it's behaving with the mobile phone. We had a pocket full of Rakuten SIMs, and supposedly they had unlimited data. As it turns out, after you use 5 gigabytes of data in a day, you start to be throttled. Well, the nice thing about that is it was very evident both while testing as well as in the data itself when the throttling kicked in. So it made it very easy to exclude that data and obviously switch to a new SIM. Because we were somewhat limited in our testing, we really just focused primarily on some of the basic RF information, looking at throughput, resource block normalized throughput, as a function of RSRP, as a function of SINR, how that throughput was achieved, MCS allocations, MIMO layers, etc. Now, in terms of the results, we used Umetrics data. This used to be Spirent Communications. It's now part of Keysight. And we use that to generate the data both in the downlink and the uplink. And in our initial testing, we primarily used UDP. And then on the last day or so, I decided to switch to TCP to see what would happen. So this is test results plotted. It's about a 350-second test. What we're plotting here is the throughput, both the 5G throughput at the physical layer, which you see in green, as well as the blue layer, which is the LTE throughput. Again, this is a 5G NSA network. And so it's interesting, this is basically the same test location. I didn't move. You start off with TCP, very low throughput, surprisingly low. You switch to the UDP protocol using Umetrics data, and all of a sudden, you see much higher data speeds, around 500 megabits with 5G and around 100 megabits with LTE. Going back and forth, it's like clockwork, where you have very good throughput or relatively good throughput, and then you have extremely low throughput. And so obviously something is happening here that's protocol related. I should also note that in our testing, these data speeds are not necessarily that great. One of the limitations we saw in our testing is that, first of all, we rarely saw MIMO. We rarely saw 4 layers of MIMO in our testing as well. We rarely saw 256 QAM. So you take that away, and the data speeds are relatively good. But again, in this case, The issue really comes down to the protocol. So let's dive just a little bit deeper. So again, this is the same time. This is the same test. Again, we're plotting on the x-axis. This is time. In this case, on the y-axis, we're plotting the resource block allocation. So with TCP and doing the HTTP file transfer, the allocation of resource blocks for both 5G and LTE is extremely low. Now we switch to UDP, and we're basically getting the full allocation of LTE resource blocks. And on the 5G side, again, it's just right at the maximum level. So clearly, we're getting the resource block allocations with UDP. The problem is with the TCP data transfers, we're not getting the resource block allocations. And in the testing I was doing, this was a Sunday morning. Nobody was outside. This is clearly not a loading situation. If it was, somebody was standing right next to me and doing full buffer tests every time I did TCP and then turning it off when they did UDP. Similar testing, but in this case, we're looking at simultaneous downlink and uplink data transfer. So on the left-hand side on the y-axis, this is the downlink throughput. On the right-hand side, this is the uplink throughput. A little bit more granularity. The solid lines are the downlink. The dashed lines are the uplink. So for example, here, this LTE PUSCH, that's the LTE uplink throughput with UDP, and it's getting right around 70 megabits per second. There's a simultaneous downlink taking place. That's the solid green line, getting close to 600 megabits per second. And then down below here, that's the LTE downlink throughput and the 5G uplink throughput. Again, 5G down, or the downlink data speeds are on the left-hand axis. The uplink speeds are on the right-hand axis. So this is UDP. Now let's switch again to TCP. Again, same location, very similar tests, simultaneous downlink, uplink transfers. Again, we see the data speeds drop substantially, lots of fluctuation. The 5G throughput is way down here, less than 200 megabits per second, compared to close to 600 megabits per second with the UDP data transfer. Just to take it one step further, it turns out the culprit was really the unscheduled slots. So we looked at the slot allocation when there was TCP, and it turns out 70% of the downlink slots went unscheduled with TCP. That compares to only 0.0 or 0.4% with the UDP data protocol. So the point here is that you really need to test all protocols. When you look at the performance of a 5G or 4G network, or any network for that matter, you're not just doing a UDP data transfer. You're doing lots of different protocols that are used for different types of data applications. So the lesson here is really test all protocols, not just a single protocol. Now I'm going to switch gears. We've got Charlie Ergen here playing the fiddle. This is testing we did, doing a comparative testing of T-Mobile and Dish Wireless in Minneapolis. This was back in December of 2023. This involved both stationary and drive testing. On the Dish network, I used the Galaxy A23 smartphone, and then on the T-Mobile network, I used the Galaxy S23 smartphone. Again, this is using the XCal platform to collect the data. One slight limitation we had is that with the Dish network, the SIM cards that came with the phone were limited to 60 gigabytes of data per month. So I purchased 2 phones, giving me 120 gigabytes of data to collect on the Dish network. And so in this study, again, primarily focused at looking at RF performance, as well as other attributes, including handover performance and latency. What I'd like to talk about is latency. So there's kind of this mindset that you can do a simple ping test and get a sense of the latency and its impact on the network. And I would argue that doing a simple ping test really doesn't tell the whole story. So first of all, a ping is really basically the ICMP protocol, which is a control protocol. Some servers in the network will deprioritize it. I've heard that operators sometimes will prioritize that particular protocol, recognizing somebody's doing a ping test, and it can lead to better results. Not sure if that's true or not, but that's the argument that's been made. The other point is that a ping is only a 32-byte packet, and that doesn't necessarily reflect the types of packets that you would see with an application like gaming. So in this case, this is using Umetrics data from Spirent, now Keysight, and it's doing a continuous UDP downlink data transfer and the uplink of 1 megabit per second. And in this case down below, this is doing a 1 megabit per second continuous uplink data transfer. What we're measuring here is the one-way latency from the phone to the server, the Umetric server. That's the uplink test. And then in this case, oh, that's the downlink test, I'm sorry, is measuring from the server to the phone. And then down below, this is measuring from the phone to the server. In this case, the server was located in California. So on an absolute basis, the latency was somewhat high compared to what the results would have been with the server in the network. But bottom line, what I want to focus on here is really looking at the distribution of the latency. So this is T-Mobile 5G SA. This is Dish. This is T-Mobile NSA. Then we have the Dish results on both SA and NSA. I should point out for the NSA results on Dish, it's using the T-Mobile network. The way I got there was forcing the phone to use NSA mode. And when you do that, because the Dish network itself is SA based, it automatically switches to the T-Mobile network. So if you were to think about the average latency, in a lot of cases, it's reasonably good. What matters, though, is this long tail. And what I've highlighted over here on the far right-hand side is basically the percentage of packets that exceeded, in this case, 110 milliseconds for the downlink one-way test. In this case, the packets highlighted here are the packets that exceeded 110 milliseconds with an uplink latency test. We did testing. I'm not showing the results today, looking at Verizon and with their 5G FWA service. And in that case, the average latency results were really good. Kind of the troubling or the concerning thing was looking at the distribution. Again, you can have a small percentage of data points where the latency is extremely high, and that can impact the user experience, even though your average result may be quite good. Now I'd like to talk about the impact of QCI on the performance of the phone. So in this case, as I mentioned before, since I locked the Dish phone to 5G NSA, it was forced to use the T-Mobile network. And if you go in then and look at the UE capability messages and you look at the QCI allocation that's being reported, in the case of the Dish phone, it was using QCI 9, which basically means the network is giving the phone a very low priority in a congested network. You compare that to the T-Mobile phone, it's getting QCI 6, which is, basically the high priority service that you would expect as a postpaid subscriber. So looking at the results here, this is a test where I was doing a downlink data transfer, both stationary as well as mobile, and then I would also start and stop one or the other phone just to look at the impact of loading on the throughput. So in the top results here, so this is showing in this plot right here, this is when the two phones are sharing the same 5G PCI. You see roughly a 6x difference in throughput, which corresponds with roughly a 6x difference in the RB allocations. That's when they're using the same 5G PCI. That's dramatic. Now, if they're using a different PCI, this could be the result of drive testing and one phone's on one PCI, one phone's on the other PCI. This also happened if I would start or stop one of the phones, then you basically have one phone operating by itself. So in this case, the results are much closer in terms of the throughput. So the lesson learned here, I guess, is that when you're looking at MVNOs as an example, if you're a consumer, anytime you have a lower priority QCI, by and large, kind of the study that we've done suggests that it really doesn't have an impact unless you're in a loaded network. So if you're testing in the middle of the night or using your phone in the middle of the night, having a lower QCI probably doesn't impact your performance. If you're going to a Taylor Swift concert and you want to upload video, is probably going to have a very detrimental impact on the user experience. So kind of for the last set of slides here, this is looking at testing we did. This involved Verizon and their 5G fixed wireless access service, which I subscribe to, as well as Midco, which offers a 2 gigabit per second fiber service to our house. And this is testing I did back in December and January of this year. So a little bit different in terms of testing, although there is a 5G network involved. You're also including fiber. So although I did use XCal to capture some of the chipset information, including over Wi-Fi, it was also using Wireshark to capture some of the packet messaging to do the analysis of the data. What I want to focus on in this presentation is really talking about the impact of the user experience. So yes, you can get 2 gigabits per second on the fiber connection. With Verizon 5G, it was 300 megabits down, 20 megabits in the uplink. But how does that really impact the user experience in terms of the typical applications that you might use? And we looked at Google Drive, Dropbox, downloading from YouTube TV, Netflix streaming, downloading content, video conferencing, web browsing, as well as Xbox gaming. And I want to share just some of those results. So it turns out that the internet, or the 2 gigabit service as an example, isn't necessarily providing you the maximum speeds. In a lot of cases, the internet and the applications can be the bottleneck itself. So in this particular test, in this upper left-hand figure here, started off, this is using my 2 gigabit fiber connection. This is the downlink data transfer information captured with Wireshark. I had a 2 megabit per second UDP data transfer. It was getting around 1.5 gigabits per second of throughput. I then immediately switched to downloading a 2 gigabyte file from Google Drive. You can see the downlink data speeds drop substantially to almost always less than 200 megabits per second. This is a bi-directional service, and so you would think the uplink would also offer 2 gigabits per second. It turns out that's not the case. Again, this is another example of a test uploading a file to Google Drive, average data speeds, just over 200 megabits per second. Now we'll switch to Verizon 5G. This is a test actually using 2 different PCs uploading simultaneously. And this was something I noticed early on in the testing, is that Google Drive was sometimes really limiting the performance of the network. And you see, even with a slower Verizon 5G service, the Verizon 5G service was actually providing more bandwidth than the Google Drive application could support. So starting off here, I have one PC. It's downloading a file at basically 75 megabits per second. I now introduce the second PC. It's also downloading at 75 megabits per second. My total throughput is now about 150 megabits per second. So what this tells me is that the bottleneck in this case is not the Verizon 5G fixed wireless access service. It's really the internet itself. And this is testing that Verizon also confirmed when I brought it to their attention. It appears that Google Drive, especially when you get some loading on their server, that they will definitely and substantially throttle the download or the upload data speeds. Continuing on this theme, I remember back in the days when operators first launched 5G millimeter wave, and they talk about, well, how fast you can download a large movie to your phone. It turns out that's really not the case. This is a YouTube TV. This is downloading, first of all, downloading a movie to my Galaxy S23 over Wi-Fi using the Midco 2 gig service. I then switched to doing it over Verizon 5G. And yes, there's a difference in data speeds. Midco is about twice as fast. But the reality is the Midco service came nowhere close to supporting the full capabilities I could offer when downloading content from an application like YouTube TV. And then lastly on this slide, just looking at PC browsing. So web browsing on your PC. What I've plotted here is various websites, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, CNN, etc. This is showing the average amount of time it took to download that page. This is multiple downloads on each website over a period of about 30 minutes. It turns out in a lot of cases, Verizon 5G fixed wireless access was actually very comparable to what you would get with Midco. And I found this surprising because, latency is definitely important when it comes to web browsing. I would have suspected a bigger impact in the results, but it turned out that was not the case. Then last slide, this is looking at Xbox gaming. I think most people believe that gaming in general is probably the most intensive application when it comes to both throughput as well as latency. Well, it turns out using Wireshark, Xbox generates very little data in the downlink and the uplink. Latency still matters. So this is using a trace route to identify those servers that were involved in the process of going from our house, the Xbox game console, to the Xbox or to the gaming center. In this case, it was an Amazon data center in Columbus, Ohio. So what I'm showing here in the gray boxes here, this is the last server that we could detect within the operator's network. So in this case, this is Vidco. You're getting around 13 milliseconds of latency from our house to that server. With Verizon, it only increases modestly to 18 milliseconds. So you've got a slight difference there in latency. What really matters is the latency to the Amazon data center where the Xbox is being hosted, or the gaming console is being hosted. And in this case, you've got 34 milliseconds. Compare that to Verizon, 41 milliseconds. So now you're talking 7 milliseconds of difference in latency. And so does that matter? And I guess I would argue here the answer is no, because you also need to factor in the human latency, basically your response time to a gaming scenario. And so these results are plotted down here. So you see with Midco, you still got the 34 seconds of latency due to the network. In the case of Verizon, is 41 milliseconds. But now you factor in the human latency or the human response time. So if you're an excellent gamer, from what I've read, it's about 150 millisecond response time. If you're an average gamer, the response time is around 275 milliseconds. So bottom line, an average gamer only has a 2.3% performance advantage with using fiber. That increases to 3.8% advantage in terms of latency if you're an excellent gamer. So again, I think the lesson here is that, I love testing RF performance and looking at peak speeds and all that sorts of stuff. But what really matters is the user experience. So I think it's really important to include that as part of your testing. And with that, I'm seeing I'm at 23 minutes. And so Kelly, I will turn that back to you for any questions that we may have.
Yeah, I actually just I have one question, but I have to say that I love that you got into the QCI stuff. That's the reason I won't let my husband switch our plan to an MVNO. I'm like, I really don't ever want to test that QCI level. All right. So Mike, you covered so many things. I love just great stuff. Great stuff. It's just fantastic information. I did want to reference another one of your recent reports really quickly that came out in January of this year, just because it touches on so much of the AI stuff. You looked at the impact of generative AI on 5G data consumption. And let's see, you had some Meta Ray-Ban glasses in the mix there and 2 Samsung smartphones. Can you give us like a 60-second sort of summary of, of what you found in that? I think, because I think it was some interesting insights.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, when you look at wearables like the display glasses, basically any application that you run on the glasses generates less data than it would on a smartphone. And that kind of stands to reason because if you look at the specs of the glasses, both in terms of the camera as well as the display resolution, it's substantially less than what you would get from a top-tier smartphone. I think the other lesson learned here is that a lot of these applications, if you're looking at, looking at or having your glasses look at something that you're looking at and say, what am I looking at? Or tell me this information. Definitely these Gen AI questions generate a lot more uplink data traffic when video and images are involved than it does just a simple query using text or voice. But in absolute terms, it's still very modest. And I give the example here of FaceTime. So FaceTime generates, roughly 2 megabits down, 2 megabits up in terms of a continuous data transfer. These questions involving video, involving images, they're a fraction of that. So if people are not worried about FaceTime and the 150 million iPhones that are out there, I think in the here and now, the impact of AI on a 5G network is relatively modest. I think there's a lot too that can be done in terms of improving the user experience without necessarily having a bigger impact on the 5G network.
Okay. Fantastic. Mike, thanks so much for the time today. Really loved the insights and just appreciate you being here. So thanks so
Sure.
much.
Thank you.
Folks, we are going to move on to our next session, which is all about device performance. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in a minute.